All right. And now I'm going to start by telling you a story that hopefully is somewhat relatable for you. I suspect it's something that's happened to many of us before. So when I was in seminary, I was taking public transit to class because I did not know how to drive yet. And besides, public transit is a great way to catch up on all that reading I had to do while I was in seminary. So I was on the train reading my New Testament textbook, and this man behind me noticed what I was reading, and he sort of leaned over and he said, "Oh, are you a seminarian?" And I said, "Oh, yes, I am," because this is something that can happen on public transit, which is that total strangers can talk to you about what you're reading. And he was very enthusiastic about my being a seminarian, and told me all about how he'd spent time at the GTU in the library, and he considered himself something of an amateur biblical scholar. And then, of course, he asked me which church I went to and which denomination I was part of. And I said that I was a Unitarian Universalist. And he said, "Oh, what's that?" And I didn't have a very good elevator speech yet then. So I said something about how we weren't really a Christian community. We didn't worship God per se. And he became very offended at this and said something along the lines of, "Well, if you don't worship God, then why do we even bother getting together on Sundays? I mean, you're not even a church, you're just a social club." And then at that point, it was my stop. So I was able to get off the train without having to continue this conversation any further. But it did get me thinking about, well, why do we get together on Sundays if we don't worship a God per se or a deity? I mean, some of us do, but not all of us do, right? I mean, that's the thing. As I've said in previous services, and as Marilyn alluded to in her reflection, is that it's hard to design inclusive UU worship because UUs believe so many things. There isn't one uniting core belief. No creed here, right? And yet we get together on Sundays. Sometimes we call it worship, sometimes we don't. Some churches don't like to call it that. They like to call it Sunday service or Sunday assembly or something to that effect. So what, is it just leftover habit from when we were Protestants that we get together on Sundays? What exactly are we doing here? What is worship to a Unitarian Universalist? So I could pull sort of the old, when I was in high school debate club, there was always the old, you can start with a dictionary definition for the thing that we're talking about, right? So I could talk about worship etymology. I could talk about the old English word worthship, which has to do with worshiping what is worthy, withholding what is worthy. Or I could talk about the Greek word that is often translated as worship in the Bible, which was proskuneo, which means to kiss, actually, or to kiss the hand. So it's sort of like literal chef's kiss. That's proskuneo. I could talk about the Merriam-Webster dictionary definition, which has to do with professing reverence or adoration, interestingly enough, for a deity. It says adoration or reverence for a deity, but it puts for a deity in parentheses. If you take all these definitions and put them together, you do eventually emerge with a picture of what worship means, which is that it means to love something worthy. It means to revere something or someone. And what does that have to do with UUs? Well, what has worth to UUs? What matters to you? What has worth to you? And, well, ask a different UU, you'll get a different answer. What's worthy to one UU may not be worthy to another UU. What one UU reveres, another UU may not revere. I mean, there are maybe some things generally that we agree on. The first principle, for instance, the inherent worth and dignity of every person. I think UUs generally agree that we do revere that. Then there's also the seventh principle, the interdependent web of all existence. I think a lot of UUs also agree that we revere nature, the natural world. We revere things like community, justice, love. compassion. We have a whole campaign called Side with Love. That's how much we revere love. So here's the thing about being a Unitarian Universalist is that we have the great privilege and also the great responsibility of choosing what we worship. And whatever it is that you or I or anyone else chooses to worship becomes holy. That is what happens to things that we worship. That is the power that we have, is to bestow holiness and sacredness on the things that we choose to worship. Because what happens when you love something? What happens when you love something? Generally, when you love something, when I love something, something about our behavior changes. We pay a lot of attention to the things that we love. We adore the things that we love. We can spend a lot of time and energy and money on the things that we love. So what are some examples? Children, family. You love your children, you spend time with your children, you loan them money, you give them a place to live if they don't have a place to live. Or nature. You spend a lot of time in nature. Spend a lot of time learning about nature, planting trees, picking up trash on the beach, going kayaking. Or there are people who love their cars, spend a lot of time washing the car, hand washing the car. When I got my new car, my cousin asked, do you hand wash it? And I said, no, who's got time for that? He said, oh, well, I mean, people really baby their cars, they hand wash their car, right? So on and so forth, pets, pancakes, cooking, reading, all of these things that you love, you spend a lot of time with them. Look at how much all of these people here loved this church, that there is a new building being raised, rising from the ground. There was no building there before. And now there's a building coming up day by day, week by week. People who loved this community, who started it in 1980 all the way until now, loved it into existence. This church would not exist without the love of its people, without the worship of its people. And so that is why we have to be careful about what we worship too, because love is infinite. Love is infinite. Love divides infinitely. Love goes on forever. Love does not end. And we are finite. We are finite beings. As human beings, we have the lives that we are given to live, however many years that is, and we have the hours in our days, and that is all we have. So while our love may be infinite, our time is finite. And so there are really only so many things and ways and places that we can only worship, because there are only so many hours in the day. So we have to be careful. We have to choose. We have to be intentional about the things, the concepts, the places, the people that we choose to worship. And it also means that given all of this choice, all of this, as I called it, privilege and responsibility, anytime we act out of reverence, anytime we act out of love, when we pay attention to what matters to us, that is an act of worship. So that could mean that going for a bike ride is an act of worship. Cleaning up the beach is an act of worship. Playing with your grandchildren, feeding the ducks, going for a drive, all of these things can be an act of worship if done intentionally, thoughtfully, if it is the result of reverence or love, of paying attention to what is worthy. Attending the annual meeting can be an act of worship. Voting at the annual meeting can be an act of worship. Going to church on a Sunday morning can be an act of worship. Making art can be an act of worship. Going for a walk with a dog can be an act of worship. Farming the land can be an act of worship. Clothing the naked, feeding the hungry, this can be an act of worship. The whole world can be filled with acts of worship if you look at it a certain way. And it means that the whole world is also filled with what we might conceivably call false idols, things that are not worthy of our adoration, things that are not worthy of our reverence, things like unrealistic beauty standards, or things like toxic masculinity, things like amassing billions and billions of dollars. For what purpose? Just to enrich yourself? It is easy to fall prey to these false idols. There are things, voices, magazines, TV shows that tell us all the time that these are things that we should worship. And it is up to us as free-thinking Unitarian Universalists to discern, to decide which things are truly worthy, which things are truly worth our time, our investment, our love, our reverence, our worship. And I think that that's part of what the 7 principles are for. The 7 principles are here to guide us in worship, to remind us of the things that are important to us, that our congregation, in being part of the Unitarian Universalist Association, has agreed to affirm and promote these 7 principles that tell us that we revere the inherent worth and dignity of every person, that we respect the free and responsible search for truth and meaning, that we love the democratic process, that we love the interdependent web of all existence, that we revere the idea of a world with peace, liberty, and justice for all, just to name a few. I think that this points us towards life, a world in which all life can thrive, in which all life is considered holy, in which all life is considered sacred, in which all people really do have inherent worth and dignity, in which all people are treated as if they really do have inherent worth and dignity. And so I ask you all to, for the next day, or perhaps for the next week, to pay attention to what and when you worship. Because you are powerful, I am powerful, we are powerful together, more than we are powerful individually, powerful enough to make things holy just by believing them to be holy, and then putting those beliefs into action. If we could point all of that love in the same direction, what do you think could happen? I'm sure that a lot of things could happen. That beloved community, that world with peace, liberty, and justice for all, if we could point all of our love in that direction, probably we could actually make it happen, because we would make it holy and sacred and true. May it be so. May it be so.